Good morning, and welcome to our latest webinar. These are a series of talks on the four last things. So if you get a chance to catch up with these things, all well and good. Now, today we're going to be talking about judgment, and it's quite an important theme, but judgment, particularly in church speak, sometimes gets a bad press. But before we talk about God and judgment, I just want to sort of ground this really in everyday life. So, for example, a lot of our culture is based upon judgment, certainly opinion, but judgment is very much part of our culture. I mean, you think about TV programs. So you've got people like Judge Rinder and Judge Judy and people like that. And we love those programs because what we tend to like about those programs is some sort of definitive revealing of truth. So, you know, if you've watched any of those programs, you know that you hear one story, then you hear another story. And, you know, these people are able to sort of piece together what is most likely. And they've heard these stories day in, day out, all the time. So they know how to spot a lie, and they know how to spot deception, and they know how to spot truth. Not always, because we're not perfect, but generally. And the reason we love these programs is because I think we live in a culture in which if the truth is kind of unpalatable, we don't really want to say it, because it's more important in our culture, I think, to want to be liked than to be truthful. And I mean, this is all part of our sort of individuality, isn't it? It's nobody wants to stick their head above the parapet and point out the thing that everybody knows but doesn't want to say. So the story, for example, like Hans Christian Andersen's, I think it was him, the Magic Suit of Clothes. You know, we all know the story, don't we? You know, where this kind of lie is cultivated, and because it's sort of wrapped in power and not wanting to be unpopular, they all go along with the lie. And of course, the moral of that story is the child is not part of that pressure group and points out what everybody knows but fails to say. You know, the king's got no clothes on. And it's a wonderful story, really, because it illustrates that actually foolishness is, well, it's, apart from being embarrassing, it's not healthy to live the lie. And what we like in people like Judge Judy and Rinder is they're like the child. They're the ones that are willing to sacrifice themselves or be unaware of what it is they're saying and the pressures, and just to speak the truth. And actually, that's what justice is all about, isn't it? It's all about truth. What is true? And being reminded lately, that wonderful phrase by Mark Twain, who said, lies, damn lies, and statistics. Uh, a rather sort of typical statement by Mark Twain, but it sort of cuts to the heart of things. That what we all desire is truth and justice. Now, the word for I think it's quite unfortunate in a way, but the word that is used in the New Testament for judgment is it's krisis, and I think it's the root word for where we get the word crisis. And of course, yeah. So judgment. So why is judgment such a, well, it only seems to be unpopular for those of a spiritual disposition. But that doesn't mean to say, I don't know, that's partly probably more to do with the sort of polemic against religion itself. So, for example, critics of the church will say, "Oh, the church is, full of judgment," and as if to say that the rest of society isn't. And I think that's not entirely honest, because we live in a society that makes judgments about all kinds of things all the time. And at the heart of what we are as human beings is a desire for truth, justice, and mercy. So, usual tea. Recently, I heard a story about a martial arts champion fighter. And he was on a plane. And as he sat on the plane, he felt somebody punch the back of his seat. And I mean, we've all sat in aeroplanes, and we've all had awkward passengers, sat with us. And, it's not uncommon to have somebody cause a scene sometimes. But he punched the back of his seat, and he didn't do anything. He said he just leaned his seat back, and the person pushed the seat forward. So he got out of his seat, and he said to the man, "What do you think you're doing?" And he said it became quite clear that the person that he was speaking to, this is the martial arts expert, that this person had never really been confronted in this way before, because he didn't know really what to do. Anyway, the upshot of the story was that this martial art expert said politely but quite firmly, I explained to him that you can't treat people like that, and that actually, if you do treat people like that, some people may not be as tolerant and as restrained. And what he said, I went on to explain to him, is that situations like this can lead to somebody getting hurt. And this was quite interesting, because he said, we had the conversation. And that person that he spoke to, he said, realized that actually how silly it had been to sort of attack the seat of somebody he didn't know. And actually attack the seat of somebody who was very physically able, but also had enough character to know that actually, the confrontation is a serious thing, and also to say that violence was not something that one should seek. And that's I would say, a moment of judgment, a moment in which somebody's behavior is called out and is corrected, because there's a sense in that story that the person who acted out was unaware of the consequences, or potential consequences, to his actions. And that sort of the guy who sort of talked to him had the wisdom to try and explain to this person. Now, that's a moment of judgment. It's a moment in which a behavior is unacceptable and is corrected. That's a moment of judgment. quite a dramatic story. But this is what we love about all sorts of things, isn't it? Like, talent shows and I'm a celebrity, get me out of here, and all. It's all to do with trial and judgment. And as human beings, we're naturally inclined to seek truth and to seek justice. It's part of who we are, to expect that. And we kind of feel uneasy about situations that we know are wrong, and yet we feel pressured not to say anything. I've always been inclined to think that actually the spiritual life is about self-sacrifice, and it is actually about speaking the truth rather than the preservation of one's own reputation. Not saying anything in order for people to like you is, for me, what we may call a self-love. It's an exercise in, it's an aberration of love. It's not what we are meant to do, and it's not what we're meant to be as Christians, as Christian ministers, obviously. And our job is really to reveal the love and justice of God. And that presents us with being in very sticky situations. So, for example, I've been in many situations in which the pressure not to speak out about certain injustices has been quite great. And but I've always tended to resist that impulse. My philosophy on this is that if something's wrong, you put it out. If a fire starts, you put it out, and you might get your foot burned in the process, but it's better than being consumed in flames. So I tend to sort of, that isn't to be judgmental. The way I look at it, it's seeking to love somebody rather than to simply cultivate them to like you. That's not the same thing. It's the story of the magic suit of clothes is all about people not wanting to be liked. But in that story, do the people love the king? No, they don't love the king. If they love the king, they'd tell him the truth, wouldn't they? They want the king to like them. And it's an exercise in self-love, I would say. It's not real love. Worrying about whether people like you or not is an exercise in vanity, I would say. And Jesus never does that, does he? Jesus only ever seeks the good for others. His own reputation, he blithely puts out there to be torn apart. And over my shoulder, you see the ultimate offering of what love looks like. Of people that had abandoned and jeered him and spat on him and abused him, and yet in the act that they indulged themselves in their abuse, he is loving them profoundly. Which is why I think the cross is such a central feature of the Christian faith, because it's the moment in which God's loving justice is revealed. That actually the cost of injustice is great. And our injustices against God and one another are great. And yet, the mercy of God in his judgment on us also prevails. So there's a balance between justice and mercy. And as Christians, we all seek to balance that, don't we? Now, if we look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, we see that judgment is part of God's character. And it has to be, doesn't it? T. Because God is love, and love demands justice. You know, we don't say God is like, you know, God likes us. No, God loves us. So, you know, and Jesus came to bring us good news, not advice. You know, advice is one thing, but it's a world of difference from good news. Good news is that God has actually done something. Good advice is you've got to do it yourself. And so, but the character of God, because he is love, God is love, and those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. We've all heard it. Means to say that justice is part of the character of God. It's part of who he is. And therefore, God cannot simply just look the other way. And you could say, well, why does God just not forgive? Why does he have to why is there a penalty for injustice? Why doesn't he just, you know, because some people think that just God wipes it out. But imagine this. There's a story that illustrates this. It's a story you may have heard before. Two boys grow up, and one goes off to university. The one decides to go and make his own way. It's a true story. Tea's getting cold, so. Just in case you're wondering what it says. So two boys grow up. One goes off to university, one goes his own way. Cut a long story short, the one ends up becoming a barrister and eventually becomes a high court judge. No, a crown court judge. And the other one goes from one thing to the next, and eventually his life ends up in tatters, and he starts to get involved in crime and is eventually caught. And one day, and these two friends now have lost touch, but one day a man stands before the judge and is found guilty. Now, during the process of the court trial, the judge realizes who it is. His friend from when he was younger. And he puts that emotion to one side. He judges the case fairly, as if he would anybody else, even himself. And he hands down a fine of £10,000. After the judgment, he disrobes and pays the fee himself. Now, that is a good example of justice and mercy. So this is what it means. If the judge had said to his friend, "Oh, I'll just let you off," that wouldn't have been justice, because there is no acceptance or consequence to the actions, willful actions. And we wouldn't simply put up with that in society, would we? Just for somebody to just be let off. Indeed, we're very keen on this, that everybody gets treated the same, don't we? High society, low society. And when there's a sense in which those from higher society are sort of been treated more leniently, there's a great injustice, isn't there? That they've been let off. You know, there's that thing to say, well, if it was anybody else, that wouldn't have happened. You know, there's that sense in which everybody must be treated the same. And so, which is right. I mean, I think that bubbles out of us being made in the image and likeness of God. That characteristic of God is woven into who we are. That desire for justice and mercy. Anyway, so the judge judges the man and he pays the fine. That's justice and mercy. We wouldn't expect somebody just to be let off for their crimes. You know, that's not justice, is it? Just to sort of, because what does that say? What it says is there's no consequence to our actions, whether they're good or bad. We couldn't live in a society that had such views. And that actually in itself is an unjust system, because it doesn't seek the truth. Now, God's the same. You know, God, the character of God and the desire for justice is that the truth must be revealed. There's that wonderful picture that Jesus paints in Matthew 25, where the dividing of the sheep and the goats. And of course, the play on words in that is that Middle Eastern sheep and goats look almost identical. I'm told the only difference is sheep's tails go down and goats go up. That may not be entirely accurate, because I'm no expert on Middle Eastern flocks, but that's what I'm told. Anyway, but they look very similar. And what the point of that story is all about is about people looking the same, but living very differently. One seeks to serve, the other one serves themselves. The one wants to love others, the others only want to love themselves. They want to be liked. And there's that interplay between, they both look the same, but they're not the same. So all human beings look the same, but they're not the same. Depends how you live and why you do what you do. So in that story, it's all about how God understands who are who. He understands who are the true sheep and who are the goats. And there's that sort of parting of the ways. And that's the sort of the judgment that Jesus talks about at the end. You know, in the end, you know, he will divide the left and the right, the sheep and the goats. In other words, God knows who you are on the inside, and the justice of God will be done to you. You know, in the end, God will reveal who you really are to the world, and what you are about. And that may be a shock, I think, to some, because I think some people appear in one way but are something else, and vice versa. So in the end, that's what that judgment scene is about. It's about that God will reveal what he knows about all of us. And that our true self will be revealed. Nothing will be hidden. All of those traits, all of those impulses, desires, all the good and the bad about us is known, and God will make that known. I think the biggest shock for many of us will be the truth that God reveals about us, because I think we have a great ability as human beings to actually tell ourselves a lie so much that actually we believe it. And we can actually kid ourselves to the point where we don't know we're kidding ourselves. But God will sort of, that's what that scene's about. I just want to take you to another passage, and it's from Matthew 24, sticking with the theme of Matthew. In 42, he says, "Therefore stay awake, for you do not know the day your Lord is coming." Now, I like that passage because we often think about judgment at the end of time and all that, you know, the end of the world. Well, I'm not so sure. Well, let me just put it like this. I wouldn't say I'm not so sure about that. I do believe in judgment. I do believe in the judgment in the end. But let me just sort of unpack that a little bit. I always think, well, say I'm 45, So if I get another 40 years, I've been lucky. But that means to say that when I die, I exit space and time. So when I die, I arrive at the end of time, or the judgment seat of God. It'll happen like that. Because I'm no longer in time, I'm no longer in space or matter. And so whether from the moment I die to the time when the grand judgment at the end happens, it will be instant for me. Which is a scary thought, because we often think of ourselves, oh, the judgment, at the end of time. Well, that could be millions of years' time. I don't know. It's a long way off. And I always say to myself, well, hang on a minute. You might say it's 1,000 years in the future, 10,000, a million years. I don't know. And nobody else does, by the way. So if anybody tells you they know when the Lord's coming back, they don't. But for me, it's certainly going to happen in the next 40 years. That doesn't seem like a great deal of time to get ready for the end. Unless you believe, I suppose, in purgatory. Well, I think purgatory gets a sort of bad press, really, especially amongst sort of very stringent Protestants. But I think there's something in it. I think there's something in it, in the sense that when I die in the next 40 years or less, will I be ready to meet God? Probably not. It's a big deal. And I'm going to be confronted with all the things of my life, the good and the bad. And I think that is it's something that we should take seriously. I do believe in the love of God prevails. Yeah, I say that. Yeah, that doesn't mean to say that there's not going to be the uncomfortableness of being confronted with who I really am, or who you really are, in the presence of one who is ultimate truth and justice and mercy and love. Now, that is something that actually I think today the theme of judgment is central about. It's about getting us to take seriously that final confrontation in which everything about us is revealed. Now, you can say that, oh, wow, that's just a sort of pessimistic judgment view of God. But if God is love and God is justice, surely judgment is part of it. And Jesus tells us, doesn't he, that in the end, there's a reckoning. And I think that is a way of saying to us, be careful how you live. Be careful what you believe. Be careful that you don't get caught up in the cycle of being one of those people that affirms those magic suit of clothes. Be somebody of truth, integrity. Be somebody who values justice and loving mercy. And at the center of this is truth. We must value that. And I always say that a healthy family is an honest family. I'm thankful that I actually come from a very honest family. But I also think church must be the same as well. It's a place where we have difficult challenges, and we have difficult, it's a society of human beings centered around our faith in Jesus Christ, who comes to lead us and love us into the kingdom. But that doesn't mean to say that we should be a society that seeks the good for one another. That's not the same thing as seeking for others to like us, but we should truly seek what is good for other people. and not to tear each other down, to build each other up. You know, these are the signs of what we see as love and truth and justice, that we care for one another, and that we're honest enough to confront the challenges that we face as a church. And when we haven't done that, when we haven't stamped out those smouldering stumps, the fire has grown and consumed us. And there are numerous examples of when we as a church, you know, full of human beings and frail, and with all the fault lines that run through human beings, the same in the church as they are everywhere else. But God expects better from us. Doesn't always get better from us, but he expects better. And I can certainly say that, being a Christian myself, I'm a much better human being than I was, or would have been without being. That is absolutely certain. I'm no doubt, personally, and in my experience, that the love of God in Jesus Christ changes lives. You know, when the lights come on and you see people's faith just grow and blossom and their lives transformed, that is the justice of God being worked out in their lives, that they become a new creation. And that's what God's doing with us. We are becoming a new creation. And the Christian life is a training for eternity. He's getting us ready, more in line with how things are going to be forever for us. And this time before our time is up on earth is a time in which we seek to embrace the justice and mercy of God, the truth of God, and in the assurance of the love of God. And judgment gets a bad press, but it's an essential part of a Christian life. And I think we often think of judgment as being sort of self-righteous, but actually it's about truth. And if we love truth, then we have to submit ourselves to the judgment and the justice of God. And I will leave you with that. And God bless. And see you next week. We're talking about heaven. Don't miss it. Bye-bye.